Right now, as you lie there listening to this, your eyes are closed, your muscles are loosening. In a few minutes, maybe less, your brain is going to do something remarkable and slightly insane. It's going to switch off most of your ability to see, mute most of your ability to hear clearly, and paralyze your body so completely that even if something walked into the room, you might not be able to move a single muscle in response. For 8 hours a night, every single night, you become one of the most defenseless creatures on the planet. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors did exactly this, lying down in open grasslands, in shallow caves, in the middle of forests thick with lions and hyenas and wolves. And they survived, not by accident, not by luck. Night after night, generation after generation, across a landscape crawling with animals that could kill a human in seconds, our species slept, mostly undisturbed, and woke up again. Here's the question that's kept anthropologists and biologists arguing for decades. Why didn't we get eaten? Predators are opportunists. They look for the easiest kill available, the weakest, the slowest, the most exposed. And a sleeping human is, on paper, the easiest kill imaginable. No claws, no fangs, no fur to survive the cold if left in the open. Slower than almost anything trying to catch us, and slower still than anything trying to catch us while we're unconscious. If evolution rewards efficiency, a large carnivore walking past a sleeping group of early humans should have seen an all-you-can-eat buffet lying perfectly still. Instead, something else happened. Something we're only beginning to understand. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what these videos are for. So get comfortable, let your body sink into wherever you're resting, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I read everyone. It's a strange kind of comfort, knowing that somewhere someone is hearing this at sunset, and somewhere else someone is hearing it in the dead of night, all of us drifting toward the same thing together. Tonight, we're going back, past the invention of the bed, past the invention of the house, past even the invention of fire, into the deep, dark hours of prehistoric nights, to figure out the actual answer to one of the strangest survival puzzles in human history. Why did the most dangerous predators on Earth, again and again, choose to leave us alone while we slept? Before we go further, it's worth sitting with just how strange this problem really is, because on the surface, it sounds like a minor curiosity. Predators don't attack sleeping humans that often. So what? But the deeper you look, the less this makes sense as a coincidence. Consider what a lion, a leopard, or a pack of hyenas is capable of. These are animals built by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to detect exactly the kind of weakness a sleeping human represents. A limping wildebeest gets singled out from the herd within seconds. An injured zebra becomes a target almost instantly. Predators have some of the most finely tuned vulnerability detection systems in the natural world. They read posture. They read breathing. They read the subtle signs of an animal that can't fight back. A sleeping human fails almost every test a predator uses to select prey, except the ones that would normally matter most. We're not fast. We're not strong compared to most large carnivores. Our teeth and nails are laughably inadequate as weapons. And crucially, when we sleep, we lose the one advantage that keeps us alive during the day: awareness. We can't see danger coming. We can't hear it clearly. We can't smell it the way many prey animals can. For 8 hours, we are, biologically speaking, sitting ducks. So the fact that early humans weren't simply picked off, camp after camp, night after night, isn't a small mystery. It's one of the more remarkable survival stories in the animal kingdom, and it forces us to ask a much bigger question. What, exactly, kept us safe? Was it something about the way we slept? Something about where we chose to sleep? Something about how we smelled, sounded, or looked to a predator scanning the darkness for its next meal? Or was it something stranger? Something about the predators themselves and how they see us that has nothing to do with vulnerability at all? Over the next couple of hours, we're going to work through all of it. We'll look at the evolutionary theories, the archaeological evidence, the behavioral research on modern predators, and the folklore that grew up around all those long, dangerous nights. We'll separate the real science from the campfire stories, and we'll end up somewhere unexpected, with an answer that says less about predators and more about what we quietly became. For now, you don't need to hold on to any of this. Just let the questions settle in the back of your mind while your body does what it's always done best at this hour. Begin to shut down, one system at a time. Let's start with the obvious problem, stated as plainly as possible. Sleep should have killed us. Every other defense a human being has depends on being awake. Our vision, sharp as it is in daylight, is nearly useless in true darkness, far worse than that of a lion, a leopard, or a hyena, all of which evolved eyes built for exactly the low-light conditions a moonless night provides. Our hearing, while decent, isn't specialized for picking out the soft padding of a predator's feet across dry grass the way a gazelle's is, and our sense of smell, compared to almost every serious predator on the African savanna, is close to non-existent. A lion can detect prey from over a mile away under the right wind conditions. Humans can barely detect what's cooking in the next room. Now take all of those already modest defenses and switch them off almost entirely. That's what sleep does. During deep sleep, the brain reduces its processing of external sound and light dramatically. During REM sleep, the stage where dreaming happens, the body goes further still. Most of your major muscle groups are chemically paralyzed. It's called REM atonia, and it exists so that we don't physically act out our dreams. It's a brilliant piece of neurological engineering for a species living in a house with locked doors. It is an absolutely terrifying vulnerability for a species living in the open on the African savanna 200,000 years ago. So here's the paradox in its full form. Natural selection is ruthless about eliminating traits that get an organism killed. If sleep made early humans catastrophically easy prey, and if that predation pressure was constant over hundreds of thousands of years, evolution should have pushed us toward something else. Lighter sleep, shorter sleep. Sleep that never fully shuts down awareness. The way some marine mammals sleep with only half their brain at a time, keeping one eye literally open. Dolphins do this. Certain birds do this. During long migratory flights, snatching seconds of sleep in one hemisphere while the other stays alert. We didn't evolve that. Humans sleep in long, deep, vulnerable blocks, with almost the entire brain going offline for hours at a stretch. If predation pressure during sleep had been as brutal and constant as the raw biology suggests it should have been, we would very likely not sleep this way today. The fact that we still sleep in these long, deep, defenseless blocks is itself a clue. It suggests that whatever kept our ancestors safe at night was effective enough and reliable enough that evolution never needed to redesign human sleep into something more defensive. That's the real mystery. Not how did some individual humans survive dangerous nights? Some certainly didn't. But how did sleep, in this exact deeply vulnerable form, remain evolutionarily viable for an entire species living for hundreds of thousands of years in landscapes full of large carnivores? It's worth comparing human sleep against the sleep strategies of other animals living under real, sustained predation pressure, because the contrast is genuinely striking. Many grazing animals living in open, predator-rich environments sleep in short, fragmented bursts, often totaling only a few hours across an entire day, broken into pieces just minutes long, interspersed with near-constant head-raising and environmental scanning. A giraffe, astonishingly, may sleep as little as 30 minutes to 2 hours across a full 24-hour period, much of it in brief standing naps lasting only a few minutes at a time. Elephants in the wild have been recorded sleeping as little as 2 hours a night, often while standing, ready to move instantly if needed. Marine mammals took an entirely different evolutionary route to the same underlying problem. Dolphins and several species of seal exhibit what's called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep. Quite literally, one half of the brain sleeps, while the other half remains awake and alert, with one eye typically staying open, corresponding to the still conscious hemisphere. This allows the animal to rest without ever fully losing environmental awareness. An elegant solution for an animal that also needs to keep breathing manually and can't afford total unconsciousness even for safety reasons unrelated to predation. Certain migratory birds show a related trick, entering brief periods of unihemispheric sleep, even mid-flight, snatching rest in seconds-long bursts without ever losing full flight control. Set human sleep against any of this, and the difference is almost jarring. We don't nap in 3-minute bursts. We don't sleep with half a brain on watch. We go under, fully, for hours at a stretch, with both hemispheres synchronizing into the same deep, unresponsive state, night after night, for the entirety of our lives. Among land mammals living anywhere near serious predation pressure, this kind of full, deep, prolonged unconsciousness is genuinely unusual. It's closer to the sleep pattern of an animal with no natural predators at all, a large, secure herbivore with nothing left to fear, or a predator itself, confident enough in its position at the top of the food chain to switch off completely without worrying who might be watching. That comparison is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's not just a curiosity, it's a clue. If human sleep architecture more closely resembles the sleep of an animal that doesn't need to worry about being hunted than the sleep of an animal that does, then whatever kept early humans safe at night must have been effective enough, consistently enough, across a long enough evolutionary timescale, that our sleep never needed to evolve the vigilance-preserving compromises so many other prey species were forced into. We didn't split the difference between rest and readiness the way a giraffe or a dolphin did. We committed fully to rest, which strongly suggests something else was handling readiness on our behalf. There are a handful of competing answers to that question, and like most genuinely interesting scientific puzzles, none of them is complete on its own. Some point to behavior, the choices early humans made about where and how to sleep. Some point to technology, especially the control of fire. Some point to social structure, the fact that humans, unlike almost any other primate, sleep in groups with built-in systems of rotating vigilance. And some point to something even stranger, the psychology of the predators themselves, and evidence that large carnivores may actively avoid humans, asleep or awake, for reasons that have very little to do with how easy we'd be to catch. We're going to walk through each of these, one at a time, because each one is a piece of the same puzzle, and none of them alone explains the whole picture. Whenever a mystery this old and this unsettling exists, folklore rushes in to fill the gaps left by hard evidence, and the story of why predators leave sleeping humans alone is no exception. Before we get into the theories that are actually well supported, it's worth spending a few minutes on the ones that aren't, because separating the two tells you a lot about how this mystery has been misunderstood for generations. The first and oldest theory is what you might call the spiritual protection explanation. Across dozens of unrelated cultures, from parts of sub-Saharan Africa to indigenous communities in North America to folklore traditions in South Asia, there are stories describing sleeping humans as protected by ancestral spirits, guardian animals, or divine watchfulness. In some traditions, it was believed predators could sense a kind of spiritual aura around a sleeping person that marked them as untouchable. It's a beautiful idea, and it clearly reflects something real people observed, namely, that sleeping humans in camps did seem to be left alone with suspicious consistency. But it explains the observation with a supernatural mechanism rather than a biological or behavioral one. The second theory, which shows up constantly in more modern pop science explanations, is the idea that human body odor itself is repellent to predators, that something in human sweat or skin chemistry sends an instinctive, "don't eat this" signal to carnivores. It's a tempting idea because it would provide a single, tidy explanation. The trouble is, the actual evidence doesn't support anything close to a universal chemical repellent. Predators absolutely do respond to human scent differently than they respond to the scent of typical prey animals. But the reason appears to be learned unfamiliarity and caution, not some kind of built-in chemical deterrent. Big cats raised without exposure to humans, or living in regions where humans are a genuinely novel presence, show far less avoidance behavior than cats living in regions with long histories of human contact. That's not what you'd expect from a hardwired chemical repellent. It's exactly what you'd expect from a learned, cultural avoidance passed down within predator populations, generation to generation, the same way avoidance of certain other animals gets transmitted. The third theory worth mentioning, because it sounds almost too strange to be real, and yet keeps surfacing in serious research, involves the idea that predators may perceive humans as a kind of super predator themselves, not prey at all, but a rival hunter to be avoided. We'll come back to this one in much more detail later, because unlike the spiritual protection theory and the scent repellent theory, this one is backed by some genuinely striking modern research involving recorded human voices and motion-triggered speakers in the middle of the African wilderness. It turns out this theory, strange as it sounds, might be closer to the truth than anything else on this list. But before we get to the super predator research, we need to go back much further, because the real answer to this mystery didn't start with human reputation. It started with something far more physical: fire. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something the lion research alone can't tell you. Human ancestors didn't sleep defenseless in only one kind of landscape, against only one kind of predator. Over the long span of our species' history, humans spread into forests, mountains, wetlands, tundra, and dense jungle, each environment with its own particular set of teeth waiting in the dark. If the super predator reputation idea is going to hold up as a real explanation, it needs to hold up across all of them, not just the open grasslands of East Africa, where the famous lion speaker experiments took place. So let's look at a few other corners of the world, because the pattern turns out to be remarkably consistent, even when the predator itself is completely different. Take the Sundarbans, the vast mangrove forest delta spanning the border of India and Bangladesh, home to one of the last significant populations of wild tigers, and famously, one of the very few predator populations on Earth still known to actively hunt humans with some regularity. For centuries, local fishermen and honey collectors working in the Sundarbans have worn masks on the backs of their heads, human-faced masks, designed specifically to exploit something researchers and local communities alike have long believed about tiger behavior: that Sundarbans tigers strongly prefer to attack from behind, avoiding a direct, face-to-face confrontation with a human who is watching them. It's a striking, almost eerie confirmation of the same underlying pattern we saw in the African lion research. Even a predator population famous for occasionally treating humans as prey overwhelmingly prefers to avoid a human who knows it's there. The danger isn't really about size, or teeth, or strength. It's about being seen, and specifically, about being seen by something that has a long, well-earned reputation for fighting back. Now travel to the forests and mountains of North America and look at black bears, and, in areas where they still overlap with human settlement, grizzly bears. Decades of wildlife management data show an extremely consistent pattern: bears that maintain avoidance behavior around humans, camps, campsites, hikers, settlements, do so almost entirely because of learned experience, both individual and, researchers increasingly believe, culturally transmitted within local bear populations. Bears raised in regions with long histories of hunting pressure and human retaliation show dramatically stronger avoidance than bears in more isolated regions with limited human contact. Wildlife biologists have a blunt way of putting this: a fed bear tends to become a dead bear, referring to the well-documented pattern that bears who lose their instinctive caution around humans, usually through repeated exposure to unsecured food rather than any change in their perception of humans as prey, tend to escalate toward dangerous encounters, and those encounters, historically and today, tend to end badly for the bear, not the human. That asymmetric consequence, playing out over generations, is precisely the mechanism the super predator theory predicts. Wolves tell a similar story, though it comes with an important complication. In parts of Europe and Asia, where wolves and humans have coexisted continuously for thousands of years, wolf attacks on humans are exceptionally rare, and wolf populations show strong, consistent avoidance behavior. But in regions where wolves were locally exterminated for a century or more and are now being reintroduced, Some wildlife researchers have observed that reintroduced wolf populations, animals with no living cultural memory, no older individuals to learn caution from, sometimes show reduced avoidance behavior in their first few generations back in a landscape, before caution reasserts itself as the population reestablishes its own internal, transmitted knowledge of what humans are and how dangerous it is to test them. If avoidance were purely instinctual and hardwired, you wouldn't expect this kind of generational reset. The fact that it happens is some of the strongest indirect evidence we have that predator caution around humans is substantially learned, not simply born. And then there's a particularly striking case from the world of big cats again. Leopards in parts of India, living in extremely close proximity to dense human settlements, sometimes just outside urban neighborhoods. Camera trap studies in these areas have documented leopards moving through residential streets at night, navigating with obvious familiarity around sleeping and waking humans, largely avoiding conflict, in landscapes where you might expect near-constant predation, given the sheer density of easily accessible human presence. Researchers studying these populations describe a kind of learned coexistence, not friendliness, not trust, but a careful, mutually maintained distance, built up over generations of both species adjusting their behavior around the other. Put all of this together, across 4 wildly different environments and 4 completely unrelated predator species, and the pattern holds remarkably well. Predators that have had long, sustained contact with humans, generation after generation, consistently develop strong avoidance behavior, reinforced not by instinct alone, but by the accumulated, transmitted memory of just how costly it has historically been to test us. It's not one story from one savanna. It's the same story, told independently, in mangrove forests, in mountain ranges, and on the edges of modern cities, by animals that have never once compared notes with one another, except through the oldest kind of notes there are, passed from one generation of predator to the next. Caution, learned the hard way, and never quite forgotten. It helps at this point to slow down and place all of this on an actual timeline, because hundreds of thousands of years is the kind of phrase that's easy to say and almost impossible to really feel. Go back roughly 2 million years to the early members of the genus Homo, Homo habilis, and, somewhat later, Homo erectus. These were not modern humans. Smaller brains, more primitive tool use, and, as far as the evidence suggests, likely still without any routine, campfire-centered use of fire. Their nighttime survival strategy was probably closer to that of other ground-sleeping primates, relying heavily on group size, on choosing naturally defensible sleeping sites, and quite possibly, some researchers suggest, on a level of nighttime predation loss that simply had to be absorbed as one of the ordinary costs of existing. This was a harder, more dangerous world to fall asleep in, and it likely stayed that way for a very long stretch of time. Move forward to somewhere around 700,000 to 800,000 years ago, and the evidence for controlled, if still occasional, fire use starts to become harder to dismiss. Scorched stone tools, patches of burned earth in the right archaeological layers, animal bones showing signs of cooking rather than raw consumption. This is still a long way from a nightly, camp-defining fire, but it marks the beginning of the relationship between our ancestors and controlled flame, a relationship that would eventually rewrite the entire calculation of nighttime survival. By around 400,000 years ago, sites across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East begin showing much stronger, more consistent evidence of routine fire use. Hearths reused repeatedly at the same location, evidence of fire maintained over extended periods rather than opportunistically created and abandoned. This is roughly the same period during which early Neanderthals were establishing themselves across Ice Age Europe, and Neanderthal sites show some of the clearest, most consistent hearth evidence of this era. Deep ash deposits, carefully placed stone rings, campsites clearly organized around a central fire in ways that suggest deliberate, repeated, intentional use rather than accident. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, people whose brains and bodies were essentially identical to yours, emerge in the fossil record somewhere around 300,000 years ago, already living within this fire-centered world, already, it seems, benefiting from the accumulated behavioral knowledge of hundreds of thousands of years of hominins who came before them and who had already begun solving the nighttime survival problem one hearth at a time. From there, the timeline compresses rapidly by comparison. Roughly 70 to 60,000 years ago, modern humans begin the great migrations out of Africa that would eventually populate every continent except Antarctica. Every one of those migrating groups carried the same nighttime toolkit with them: fire, group sleep, defensible site selection, adapting the specifics to whatever new landscape and whatever new predators they encountered, from the cave lions of Ice Age Europe to the short-faced bears of prehistoric North America, animals significantly larger and more dangerous than almost anything alive on Earth today. Agriculture, permanent settlement, and eventually cities are a comparatively recent development, emerging only in the last 12,000 years or so, meaning that for well over 95% of the time anatomically modern humans have existed, we lived exactly the way we've been describing tonight: mobile, fire-centered, group sleeping, careful about where we lay our heads down each night. The walled bedroom you're falling asleep in right now represents a genuine innovation, but a remarkably recent one, layered thinly on top of a much older, much longer foundation of firelight and watchfulness that quietly shaped almost everything about how your body still approaches the act of sleep. To really feel what all of this meant in practice, it helps to imagine it directly, rather than simply describing it in the abstract. So close your eyes, if they aren't already, and let's walk through one single night, 40,000 years ago, from beginning to end. The sun is going down over a wide river valley. Your group, perhaps 15 or 20 people, a handful of families bound together by kinship and long habit, has been moving steadily toward a familiar campsite for the last hour of daylight, a shallow rock overhang above the floodplain, its back wall solid stone, its open front facing the river below. You've camped here before. You know its angles. You know exactly how far the firelight reaches before it fades into darkness, and exactly where that darkness begins. Someone is already building the fire, coaxing a small ember caught earlier in the day into a proper flame, feeding it carefully with dry tinder, before adding the heavier wood gathered on the walk-in. It catches, and the light immediately pushes the shadows back, carving a warm, flickering circle out of the coming dark. You feel your shoulders drop slightly, a tension you hadn't fully noticed easing now that the fire is lit. Dinner is simple, eaten close to the flames, voices low, the day's events discussed and rediscussed in the easy, repetitive way conversation tends to unfold at the end of a long walk. Children are settling, tucked against parents or grandparents, already half asleep before the adults have finished eating. Somewhere near the fire's edge, someone is quietly working a stone tool, more out of habit than necessity, the familiar rhythmic sound of it almost as soothing as the crackle of the flames. As full darkness falls, the group settles into the rough circle you've used at this site a dozen times before. Fire at the center, bodies arranged around it, backs mostly to the stone wall behind, faces angled loosely toward the open approach across the riverbank. Nobody assigns a watch out loud. Nobody needs to. It simply happens, the way it always happens. Someone stays awake a little longer than the rest, tending the fire, listening to the ordinary night sounds settle into their expected pattern. Somewhere well past midnight, far off across the river, something calls out, low, distant, unmistakably, a predator's voice carried on the night air. In the fire's glow, one or two heads lift slightly, ears tuned toward the sound, tracking its distance and direction with the kind of unconscious, practiced calculation that comes from a lifetime of sleeping in a world that requires it. The sound doesn't come closer. After a moment, the heads settle back down. The fire is fed one more log, mostly out of habit. The night continues. Hours later, the sentinel changes without ceremony. Someone simply wakes on their own, restless or thirsty or responding to some quiet trigger of a body that's rested enough for now, and finds the fire burning low. They add wood without thinking much about it, glance once toward the dark tree line across the river, and settle back down near the flames, taking up, without ever calling it that, the watch that someone else has just quietly finished. By the time the sky begins to lighten, gray creeping up from the eastern horizon, the fire has burned down to deep orange coals, tended all night long by no one in particular and everyone in turn. Birds begin calling, someone stirs, stretches, adds the last of the firewood before the sun makes it unnecessary. The camp wakes slowly, unhurried, entirely undisturbed, exactly as it has, on most nights, for longer than any single person in that circle could ever fully explain. Nothing dramatic happened. That's the entire point. An uneventful night, defended by nothing more dramatic than fire, proximity, and the quiet, distributed attentiveness of a group that had, across countless generations before them, already worked out exactly how to make a night like this one safe enough to sleep through completely. If there's one single technology that changed the entire calculation of nighttime survival for early humans, it's fire. And it's worth being precise about when this actually enters the story, because the timeline itself is part of the mystery. Evidence for controlled fire use goes back at least 1 million years, with some contested sites suggesting even earlier dates. But evidence for fire as a routine, nightly, camp-defining feature of human life, not just occasional opportunistic use, but a fire that burned every single night at the center of where people slept, becomes much clearer and much more consistent starting somewhere between 400,000 and 300,000 years ago. That timing matters because it roughly overlaps with major shifts in human sleep architecture and social organization that anthropologists have long puzzled over. Before routine fire, our ancestors, and earlier hominin species before them, were almost certainly at the mercy of the same predation pressures every other primate faces. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, sleep in trees specifically because it puts vertical distance between them and ground predators. Gorillas build fresh nests every night, often incorporating some elevation or thick vegetation cover. Nearly every great ape species that doesn't have fire relies on height, concealment, or sheer group size as its primary nighttime defense. Humans gave up sleeping in trees a long time ago. Our bodies changed to reflect it. Modern human hip and shoulder anatomy is considerably less suited to the kind of overhead branch-gripping sleep that chimpanzees still practice. That's a serious evolutionary bet. Trading tree sleeping for ground sleeping only makes sense if something else stepped in to cover the protective gap that height used to provide. Fire is almost certainly that something. A controlled, tended fire does several things simultaneously that nothing else in the early human toolkit could match. It provides light, which strips away one of the predator's biggest advantages: low light vision, superior to our own. A firelit campsite eliminates the total darkness that gave nocturnal hunters their edge, forcing them to rely on senses and approaches that are far more detectable by watchful humans. It provides heat, which matters less for predator deterrence directly, but which allowed early humans to sleep in more open, more visible locations, rather than being forced into cramped, defensible caves and crevices purely for warmth. And most importantly, fire appears to trigger a deep, likely instinctual avoidance response in most large predators. Lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves, across dramatically different environments and evolutionary histories, show consistent avoidance of active fire. Some researchers believe this avoidance response predates humans entirely, tied to the general danger fire poses to any animal, human or otherwise. Others argue that predator avoidance of fire, specifically near human settlements, is at least partly learned, reinforced over countless generations of dangerous encounters with fire-wielding, fire-defended human groups. Either way, the effect is the same. A fire burning through the night at the center of a sleeping group does something remarkable. It doesn't just provide light and warmth. It creates a kind of invisible boundary, a ring most large predators are reluctant to cross, precisely during the hours when humans are at their most physically defenseless. This matters enormously for the vulnerability paradox we talked about earlier. Remember, the puzzle wasn't just, how did individual humans avoid being eaten? It was, how did sleep remain evolutionarily viable in its long, deep, vulnerable form? Fire offers a genuinely satisfying piece of that answer. If a nightly fire dramatically reduced predation risk during sleep, there would have been far less evolutionary pressure to redesign human sleep into something lighter or more defensive. The vulnerability could remain because the environment around that vulnerability had changed. But fire alone doesn't explain everything. A fire needs tending. Someone has to keep it burning, add fuel through the night, watch for it dying down. And that single requirement, the need for a fire to be actively managed through the darkest hours, points us directly toward the next major piece of the puzzle, the way early humans actually organized their sleep. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Almost no human society in recorded history, and almost certainly no human society in prehistory, slept the way most people in industrialized countries sleep today, as one continuous, unbroken 8-hour block, alone or with a single partner, behind a locked door. For most of human history, sleep was communal, fragmented, and watched. Anthropological studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, whose way of life still preserves elements likely similar to ancient human patterns, reveal something fascinating about nighttime vigilance. Researchers who monitored sleep patterns across entire Hadza camps found that, remarkably, there was almost never a moment during the night when every single member of the group was asleep simultaneously. At any given point, someone, somewhere in camp, was awake, not because of a formal rotating watch schedule, but because individual variation in sleep timing, combined with natural nighttime wakings, meant the group's collective vigilance covered nearly the entire night almost by accident. This is sometimes called the sentinel hypothesis of human sleep, and it's a genuinely elegant idea. If individual humans within a group have naturally varied sleep-wake patterns, some drifting off earlier, some waking earlier, some experiencing brief wakeful periods in the middle of the night, then a group large enough will, almost mathematically, have near-continuous partial vigilance without anyone needing to sacrifice their own sleep for guard duty. Nobody has to stay awake on purpose. The variation does the work. This connects directly back to something we touched on earlier, the strange fact that human sleep architecture never evolved toward lighter, more defensive sleep, despite the obvious vulnerability. If group-level vigilance was already solving the safety problem at the population level, there was no evolutionary pressure pushing individual sleep toward something lighter or more fragmented. Each person could sleep deeply and safely, precisely because they weren't the only line of defense. The group was. There's also compelling evidence that early human sleeping arrangements weren't just about proximity, but about deliberate spatial structuring. Archaeological reconstructions of ancient campsites, inferred from hearth positions, debris patterns, and comparative studies of contemporary foraging societies, often show a rough circular or clustered arrangement, with the fire at the center and sleeping areas arranged around it. This isn't just cozy, it's tactical. And a circular sleeping arrangement around a central fire means that from any single point around the perimeter, an approaching predator would need to cross a zone of firelight and pass close to multiple potentially wakeful humans before reaching any individual sleeper. There's no easy, unguarded angle of approach. Compare this to a solitary sleeper, or a small isolated pair, sleeping in the open with no fire and no surrounding group. That configuration offers a predator exactly what it wants: an unguarded, undefended approach from any direction, toward a target with no backup. It's not a coincidence that solitary humans sleeping in genuinely predator-dense wilderness, historically and even in some modern accounts from regions with large carnivore populations, carries measurably higher risk than groups sleeping around a fire. The group isn't just social comfort, it's architecture. It's a defense system built out of bodies and firelight and the simple, distributed unpredictability of when each person happens to be awake. There's one more layer to this worth mentioning, because it connects sleep architecture to something deeply cultural that still echoes today. Many traditional societies, across wildly different continents and unconnected cultural lineages, developed formalized versions of nighttime vigilance, designated watch periods, ritual songs or chants performed at specific points in the night, even structured checking-in behaviors, where someone would quietly confirm the group's safety before returning to sleep. Some anthropologists argue these practices represent a cultural layer built on top of the natural sentinel effect, humans noticing, consciously or not, that group vigilance kept them safe, and then formalizing and reinforcing that protection through ritual and tradition, long after anyone remembered exactly why the tradition began. So far, we've talked about fire and about group sleeping arrangements, but there's a third layer to this story that's easy to overlook, where, precisely, early humans chose to sleep in the first place. Site selection sounds like a mundane detail next to fire and social structure, but the archaeological and ethnographic record suggests it may have been just as important. Across an enormous range of environments and time periods, human campsites show a consistent preference for locations that offer what researchers sometimes call defensible topography, positions with limited approach angles, natural barriers on at least one or two sides, and clear sightlines across open ground on the remaining approach. Rock shelters and shallow cave mouths were especially favored, and it's easy to understand why. A shelter with a solid back wall and only a single open front eliminates the vast majority of possible approach angles a predator could use. Instead of needing to watch 360 degrees of darkness, a group sleeping in a rock shelter only needs to watch one relatively narrow arc, the open front, usually lit by the central fire, usually the only direction from which anything could approach unseen. Elevated ground served a similar function in more open environments. A slightly raised campsite, even by just a few feet, dramatically increases the distance at which an approaching animal becomes visible, especially under moonlight or firelight, and dramatically increases the noise a predator would need to make while climbing or navigating that elevation change. Noise that, remember, doesn't need to wake every sleeper, just one, for the sentinel effect to kick in. Proximity to water is a more complicated factor. Water is essential, obviously, but water sources are also where predators themselves gather, especially at dawn and dusk when both predator and prey activity peaks. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer camp placement show a consistent pattern of choosing sites close enough to water for practical access, but with enough physical or visual separation, a rise in terrain, a stand of trees, a bend in a riverbank, to avoid camping directly on the most heavily trafficked predator routes to and from that water. All of this site selection behavior points towards something important. Early humans weren't just passively hoping predators would leave them alone. They were actively engineering their environment, night after night, to make an attack as difficult, as visible, and as costly as possible for any predator considering it. Combine defensible topography with a central fire, with the near-continuous partial vigilance created by group sleep variation, and you start to see the outline of a genuinely sophisticated, multi-layered defense system, one built not out of weapons or walls, but out of behavior, choice, and accumulated knowledge passed down across countless generations of trial, error, and hard-won survival. And yet, even accounting for fire, group vigilance, and careful site selection, there's still something unaccounted for. Because predators don't just avoid well-defended camps. Field research over the last 2 decades has revealed something stranger. Many large predators appear to avoid humans specifically, not campsites in general, not any sleeping mammal in general, but humans in particular, at a level that goes beyond what fire and site defense alone would explain. Which brings us to the strangest and, in some ways, most unsettling part of this entire story: what predators actually think of us. There's an assumption buried underneath most of tonight's discussion that's worth pulling out into the open and examining directly. The assumption that night itself was the primary danger window, the hours when predators were most actively hunting and humans were most actively at risk. It's a reasonable assumption. It's also, according to a considerable amount of predator behavior research, not quite accurate. Many of the large predators most associated with danger to early humans aren't actually strictly nocturnal hunters. Lions, for instance, are more accurately described as crepuscular and opportunistically nocturnal, meaning their hunting activity peaks not in the deep, dark middle of the night, but in the transitional light of dusk and dawn, when there's just enough remaining visibility to spot prey, but low enough light to still provide some concealment during the stalk. The absolute dead of night, particularly on clear, moonless nights, often sees comparatively reduced lion hunting activity, partly because even a lion's superior night vision has real limits in true darkness, and partly because many prey species themselves reduce movement during the darkest hours, offering fewer opportunities to hunt at all. This matters enormously for our story, because it means the deepest, most vulnerable hours of human sleep, the long stretch of full darkness between the fading of dusk and the first hint of dawn, may never have been quite as dangerous as instinct alone would suggest. The riskiest windows, if this research holds, were more likely the transitional edges, the hour or two after full dark fell, when predators were still actively hunting, and a human camp might not yet be fully settled, and the hour or two before dawn, when hunting activity picks back up as the sky begins to lighten and prey animals begin to stir. It's probably not a coincidence that these same transitional windows show up repeatedly in traditional practices around the world as periods of heightened caution. Many contemporary hunter-gatherer societies show clustering of camp-settling behavior, specifically timed to be well underway before true dusk sets in, ensuring the fire is established and the group is settled before the riskier transitional hunting window begins. Similarly, the first activity of the day in many traditional societies is often deliberately delayed slightly past the earliest light, rather than beginning the moment the sky starts to brighten. A small, practical adjustment that, whether consciously understood as predator avoidance or simply passed down as the way things are done, neatly avoids the second dangerous transition window. There's a broader lesson buried in this that connects back to nearly everything else we've covered tonight. The defense our ancestors built wasn't a blunt, always-on shield operating at maximum vigilance through every hour of darkness equally. It was something more precise, more efficient, and honestly more elegant than that. A system calibrated to the actual, specific rhythm of real predator behavior, concentrating caution and vigilance where the genuine risk was highest, while allowing the deepest, most restorative hours of the night to remain exactly as deep and as restorative as human biology needed them to be. It wasn't paranoia stretched across an entire night. It was precision, applied exactly where precision mattered most. Everything we've discussed so far treats the sleeping group as a single, roughly uniform unit. Bodies arranged around a fire, vigilance distributed evenly across the night. But within any real early human camp, vulnerability was never evenly distributed. Infants, young children, the elderly, and anyone sick or injured represented a different, deeper layer of risk, and the archaeological and ethnographic record suggests early human groups developed specific, deliberate strategies to protect exactly these individuals. Start with infants, because infant sleep is, if anything, an even more extreme version of the vulnerability paradox we opened with tonight. A human infant cannot regulate its own body temperature effectively. It cannot move away from danger. It cannot make itself quiet on command. And unlike an adult, whose breathing and stillness during sleep are at least relatively unobtrusive, an infant's cries carry, sometimes for a considerable distance, precisely because evolution needed infant distress calls to reliably summon a caregiver's attention even across a crowded, noisy camp. You might expect that carrying quality to be a liability in a predator-dense landscape, and in isolation, it would be. But the near-universal solution across virtually every documented traditional human society, ancient and contemporary alike, is co-sleeping. Infants and very young children sleeping in direct physical contact with a caregiver, almost always the mother, throughout the night. This isn't simply a matter of convenience or bonding, though it certainly serves both. It also means that the single most vulnerable member of any human group was, throughout the night, physically touching the single most attentive and responsive adult in that group. Any disturbance, any unusual movement or sound near an infant would almost certainly wake or partially wake the co-sleeping caregiver, turning what should have been the camp's greatest vulnerability into, functionally, one of its most closely monitored positions. Elderly members of early human groups occupied a different, and in some ways more paradoxical, role. Physically, older individuals were often less capable of fleeing or fighting off a threat, but ethnographic research on contemporary hunter-gatherer societies consistently shows that older adults tend to sleep less, and more lightly, than younger adults, a pattern borne out in modern sleep science as well, where reduced deep sleep duration and more frequent nighttime waking are well-documented features of aging. Rather than treating this as simply a loss, several anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza have proposed what's sometimes called the grandmother sentinel pattern, the idea that the lighter, more fragmented sleep typical of older group members may have functioned, whether by evolutionary design or simple fortunate consequence, as an additional, semi-continuous layer of nighttime vigilance, precisely during the hours when younger, more physically capable adults were sleeping most deeply. It's a striking possibility that the biological changes to sleep which come with age, changes we tend to think of purely as decline, may once have carried real protective value for the entire group. Sick or injured individuals present the hardest case, because there's no elegant behavioral solution to the vulnerability an illness or injury creates, only the same underlying tools applied more intensively. Ethnographic accounts describe injured or ill group members being positioned deliberately closer to the fire, closer to the physical center of the sleeping arrangement, surrounded on more sides by other bodies rather than placed anywhere near the camp's exposed perimeter. It's a small, almost intuitive adjustment, but it reflects the same underlying logic running through everything else we've discussed tonight. Vulnerability wasn't eliminated, because it couldn't be. It was managed, distributed, and buffered through fire, through positioning, through the accumulated half-conscious wisdom of groups who had, across countless generations, learned exactly where the greatest risk lived each night, and exactly how to build a wall of watchfulness and warmth around it. In the mid-2010s, a team of researchers working in South Africa's Greater Kruger region ran an experiment that's since become one of the most cited pieces of evidence in this entire area of study. They set up motion-triggered speakers at watering holes frequented by lions, apex predators with essentially no natural enemies of their own. The speakers played recordings, and the researchers compared how lions reacted to the sound of ordinary human conversation against how they reacted to the sounds of other predators, including lions themselves, and to gunshots, a sound directly associated with human hunting. The results were striking. Lions didn't just react cautiously to human voices. They fled from the sound of calm, ordinary human conversation more readily, and more quickly, than they fled from the sound of other lions, and about as readily as they fled from gunshots. Let that sit for a second. The apex predator of the African savanna, an animal capable of killing prey many times its own size, an animal with no evolutionary history of being meaningfully hunted by other lions, treated the mere sound of two humans talking as more threatening than the sound of a rival pride. This wasn't an isolated finding either. Similar studies conducted across multiple predator species and multiple regions, involving leopards, hyenas, and other large carnivores, have found comparable patterns. The specific numbers vary, but the overall trend is remarkably consistent. Large predators, across environments where humans have had any sustained historical presence, treat humans as something closer to a rival apex predator to be avoided, rather than a prey animal to be pursued. This is the super predator theory we mentioned earlier, and the evidence behind it goes a long way toward explaining something the fire and campsite explanation alone couldn't fully account for: why predators seem to avoid humans even in situations where fire isn't present, where sight defense is minimal, and where a genuinely opportunistic predator, thinking purely in terms of ease of capture, should still see us as an appealing target. The leading explanation researchers have proposed is that this avoidance isn't instinctual in the way, say, a gazelle's fear of a lion is instinctual, deeply encoded, present from birth, requiring no individual learning. Instead, it appears to be substantially learned and culturally transmitted within predator populations, reinforced over countless generations by the genuinely severe consequences predators have historically faced when they did attack humans. Unlike almost any other prey species, humans have spent tens of thousands of years responding to predator attacks not just with individual defense, but with coordinated, sustained, often lethal retaliation, hunting parties, traps, organized culling of problem individuals. A lion that successfully kills a zebra faces no further consequence from the herd. A lion that kills a human, historically, has faced an outsized, disproportionate, and often fatal response from that human's entire community. Over enough generations, that asymmetry appears to have shaped predator behavior at a population level. Predator populations living in regions with long, continuous histories of human presence show markedly stronger avoidance behavior than predator populations in regions where sustained human contact is more recent or more limited. That's exactly the pattern you'd expect from learned, culturally reinforced avoidance passed down within predator communities. Young animals observing and absorbing caution around humans from older, experienced individuals in their group, rather than something hardwired into every member of the species from birth. There's something almost humbling in this. For all the emphasis we tend to place on human physical vulnerability, our weak claws, our poor night vision, our defenseless sleep, the research increasingly suggests that a huge part of the reason we weren't simply hunted into extinction across hundreds of thousands of years of sleeping defenseless on open ground has less to do with any specific defense we built, and more to do with what we represented to the animals watching us from the darkness. Not an easy meal, but a genuinely dangerous, unpredictable, collectively retaliatory force that was safer, in the long run, to simply avoid. Fire kept the darkness at bay. Group sleep kept a portion of the camp watching at all times. Careful site selection narrowed the angles of attack. And underneath all of it, reinforced over uncounted generations, was a reputation, one written not into our biology, but into the learned caution of the predators themselves. Everything we've walked through tonight describes a system: fire, group vigilance, site selection, predator reputation, that worked remarkably well for an extraordinarily long stretch of human history. But systems evolve, and it's worth spending a few minutes tracing how this particular one gradually transformed, across tens of thousands of years, into something that eventually stopped needing most of its original components at all. The first major shift came with more permanent shelter. Rock shelters and shallow caves offered natural defensible topography, as we discussed earlier, but they were also geographically fixed. You needed to live near one to benefit from it. As early humans began constructing their own shelters, first simple windbreaks and lean-tos, later more substantial structures using wood, hide, bone, and eventually mud brick and stone, they were, in effect, manufacturing defensible topography wherever they chose to settle, rather than searching the landscape for it. A constructed wall does everything a cave's back wall once did: eliminates approach angles, narrows the zone requiring active vigilance. But it can be built anywhere, which freed early human settlement patterns from a dependency on naturally defensible geography. The domestication of dogs, likely somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years ago, depending on which genetic and archaeological estimates you favor, added an entirely new layer to the system, and arguably one of the most efficient ones. A dog's senses of smell and hearing dramatically outperform a human's, especially at night. And unlike a human sentinel, a dog can maintain that heightened sensory vigilance while technically on duty, without sacrificing anything resembling normal rest the way a human night watcher would. Early domesticated dogs effectively extended the sentinel hypothesis we discussed earlier, adding sensory coverage the human portion of the group simply couldn't provide on its own, particularly around scent detection, where humans have always been comparatively weak. The rise of agriculture and permanent settlement starting roughly 12,000 years ago in various parts of the world, changed the calculation again, though in a more complicated way than you might expect. Permanent villages allowed for far more substantial, far more permanent defensive architecture, actual walls, sometimes palisades, sometimes eventually stone fortifications. But they also concentrated human population, and alongside it, human food stores, livestock, and waste in ways that could attract different kinds of predator attention than a small, mobile foraging group ever had to contend with. Livestock, in particular, introduced an entirely new category of nighttime vulnerability. Since domesticated animals generally lack the evolved defenses, human or otherwise, that had protected human sleepers for so long. A significant amount of early agricultural and pastoral architecture, pens, byres, walled enclosures, appears to have been built specifically to extend human-style nighttime protection to newly vulnerable domesticated animals, essentially applying the campsite defense playbook to an entirely new category of sleeper. By the time you reach the walled cities of the ancient world, the underlying logic hadn't changed nearly as much as the technology had. A city wall is, in a very real sense, the rock shelter's back wall and the campfire's ring of light, scaled up and made permanent. A single, continuous barrier narrowing the approach angles available to any threat, predator, or otherwise, down to a small number of heavily watched, heavily defended points. Night watchman, a role that appears independently in nearly every early urban civilization from Mesopotamia to ancient China, are a direct institutional descendant of the sentinel hypothesis. Formalized, specialized, no longer distributed accidentally across a sleeping group's natural variation in wakefulness, but assigned deliberately to specific individuals whose entire job, for a defined stretch of night, was simply to watch. And your own bedroom, tonight, sits at the far end of that same unbroken chain. A door with a lock is a wall with a single, controllable approach angle. A window is a controlled, monitorable opening rather than an exposed edge. The house around you is doing, quietly and almost invisibly, exactly what a rock shelter did 40,000 years ago, and what a village palisade did 12,000 years ago, narrowing the world down to a small, defensible, watchable perimeter, so that everything inside it, including you, right now, can afford to switch off completely. If you've ever spent a night camping somewhere, genuinely far from artificial light and human noise, you'll know that darkness doesn't mean silence. If anything, the world gets louder once the sun goes down. Insects, distant calls, the wind moving through vegetation, in ways that sound completely different than they do in daylight. For early humans, that nighttime soundscape wasn't background noise to be tuned out. It was information, constantly updating, constantly being processed, even by sleeping minds. This is where the sentinel hypothesis we discussed earlier connects to something even more fundamental about how sleep actually works. Sleep, even deep sleep, was never a state of total sensory shutdown. The sleeping brain continues processing auditory information throughout the night, filtering most of it as unimportant background. The same wind, the same insect calls, the same familiar rustle of a sleeping companion shifting position, while remaining primed to interrupt sleep immediately for anything that breaks the expected pattern. This is why a parent can sleep through a thunderstorm and still wake instantly at the faint sound of their child stirring in the next room. The filtering isn't about loudness. It's about relevance, learned and continuously updated by a brain that never fully stops listening. Early human camps almost certainly relied heavily on exactly this mechanism, layered across an entire sleeping group rather than a single individual. Every person carried their own internal library of normal nighttime sounds for that specific location, the particular rhythm of wind through that particular stretch of trees, the distant, familiar calls of nocturnal birds and insects known to be harmless, even the individual sleep sounds of other group members. A change in any of these patterns, an unfamiliar rustle, a sudden silence where there should have been the ordinary hum of insect activity, animals falling quiet in a way that often precedes a predator's approach, had the potential to interrupt sleep, even lightly, even without full waking, triggering exactly the kind of partial arousal that could then escalate into full wakefulness if the disturbance continued. This also helps explain something that might otherwise seem like a design flaw in human sleep: how easily we startle awake, and how disproportionate that startle response can feel relative to the actual sound that triggered it. A single snapped twig, an unexpected rustle. From a modern perspective, jolting fully awake, heart pounding, over something so small can feel almost embarrassingly oversensitive. But from an evolutionary perspective, that oversensitivity was almost certainly the entire point. A sleeping human, 40,000 years ago, who ignored ambiguous, potentially meaningless nighttime sounds, paid no price on the vast majority of uneventful nights, but risked everything on the rare night when that ambiguous sound turned out to be real. Natural selection, faced with that kind of asymmetric cost, reliably favors oversensitivity over calm indifference, even at the price of a great many unnecessary startled awakenings across a lifetime. The occasional false alarm was a small cost. A missed real one wasn't. Group sleeping likely amplified this effect in a useful way too. A disturbance significant enough to wake one member of a sleeping group, even briefly, often produced small, barely conscious ripples of alertness through nearby sleepers. A shift in breathing, a slight change in posture, sometimes enough to nudge a lightly sleeping neighbor toward wakefulness as well, without either party ever fully processing why. It's a subtle, almost invisible form of collective vigilance, running quietly underneath the more obvious mechanisms of fire and site selection and deliberate watchkeeping, built not out of any conscious system at all, but simply out of what happens when a group of highly social, highly sound-sensitive animals sleep close enough together to share, in small unconscious fragments, each other's alertness. None of this means early human sleep was perfectly safe. It wasn't. The fossil and archaeological record includes real, if relatively rare, evidence of predation on early humans and earlier hominin species. Bite marks on bones consistent with large cats. Remains found in what appear to have been predator dens or feeding sites. The defenses we've talked about tonight: fire, group vigilance, site selection, predator caution, dramatically reduced the risk. They didn't eliminate it. And it's out of that residual risk, that small but real possibility that something could go wrong in the deep hours of the night, that some of humanity's oldest and strangest folklore was born. Sleep paralysis is a genuinely fascinating example. It's a real, well-documented neurological phenomenon in which a person becomes consciously aware while the muscle paralysis of REM sleep is still active, meaning they're awake, in a sense, but completely unable to move, often accompanied by a vivid and deeply unsettling sensation of a presence in the room, sometimes a feeling of pressure on the chest, sometimes fully formed hallucinations of a figure watching from the shadows or sitting nearby. What's remarkable is how consistent the folklore surrounding this experience is across cultures with no historical contact with one another. The night hag of European folklore, the old hag tradition in Newfoundland, the kanashibari of Japanese tradition. Similar figures appear in folklore from West Africa, from Southeast Asia, from indigenous traditions across the Americas, all describing, in strikingly similar terms, a paralyzing nighttime visitation, often by some kind of predatory or malevolent watching presence. Many researchers who study the intersection of sleep science and folklore believe this consistency isn't coincidental. It likely reflects something close to a shared, universal human neurological experience: the genuine terror of waking, paralyzed, in darkness, with an ancient, deeply buried evolutionary instinct screaming that something might be watching, being interpreted, independently, across countless unconnected cultures, through the lens of whatever supernatural framework that culture already possessed. The paralysis is real. The vulnerability it represents is exactly the vulnerability we've been talking about all night. The moment when the body's defenses are switched off and awareness hasn't fully returned. What each culture chose to imagine standing in the darkness during that vulnerable moment tells you less about what was actually there and more about how universally, and how deeply, that particular fear of nighttime helplessness runs through our shared evolutionary memory. It's a strange kind of comfort, in its own way, to realize that the fear itself is ancient and shared, that somewhere in the deep architecture of your own mind is the same instinct that made a person 40,000 years ago check the tree line one more time before finally letting their eyes close. Nightmares themselves, separate from sleep paralysis specifically, carry a related evolutionary story worth mentioning here. Some sleep researchers have proposed what's known as the threat simulation theory of dreaming. The idea that the dreaming brain, particularly during vivid REM sleep, functions partly as a kind of low-cost rehearsal space, running simulations of dangerous encounters so that the waking brain has, in some small sense, already practiced responding to them. Predator chase dreams are among the most common nightmare themes reported across cultures worldwide, even among people living in entirely predator-free modern environments who have never encountered a dangerous wild animal in their lives. That persistence is telling. It suggests the dreaming brain is still running very old software, still occasionally rehearsing a threat that hasn't been relevant to most of its owners in thousands of years, simply because that rehearsal was valuable for so much longer than it's been irrelevant. If you've ever woken from a dream of being chased with your heart pounding, functionally unharmed, but genuinely convinced for a few groggy seconds that something had been chasing you, you've felt, in miniature, an echo of exactly the vigilance this entire story has been about. Here's something worth noticing about your own life. Right now, tonight, almost none of the actual dangers your ancestors defended against still exist in the environment where you're falling asleep. There are, in all likelihood, no lions circling your bedroom, no hyenas testing the edge of your firelight, and yet the instincts built across those hundreds of thousands of dangerous nights haven't gone anywhere. They're still quietly running in the background of your nervous system, shaping behavior you probably never thought to connect to prehistoric predator avoidance. Consider how many people, even in the safest modern homes, feel a small, involuntary unease sleeping with their back to an open door, or in an unfamiliar room with the layout not yet mapped in their mind. Consider the disproportionate comfort so many people report from white noise, from the low hum of a fan, from any steady, unchanging background sound. Not unlike, some researchers have speculated, the steady, low crackle of a fire that once meant, on some deep unconscious level, that the watch was being kept and the group was safe. Consider how much harder it is for most people to fall into deep sleep in a completely unfamiliar location on the first night. A well-documented phenomenon researchers call the first night effect, in which one hemisphere of the brain shows measurably reduced sleep depth and heightened vigilance compared to the other, almost as if some ancient part of the brain is quietly volunteering for sentinel duty in an unfamiliar, unverified environment. Even something as simple as the almost universal human preference for sleeping in an enclosed, walled space rather than fully open ground echoes, distantly, the defensible topography preferences of ancient campsite selection. Your bedroom walls are doing, symbolically and psychologically, something not entirely unlike what a rock shelter's back wall once did, narrowing the angles the sleeping mind needs to worry about, even if the modern mind has no lions left to worry about at all. None of this means you need to think about any of it tonight. If anything, it's the opposite. Every uneasy edge those old instincts once needed to watch for has been resolved, generation after generation, by exactly the defenses we've spent the last 2 hours walking through. The fire that kept the dark at bay, the group that kept part of itself awake so the rest could rest deeply, the careful choice of shelter, the quiet, accumulated reputation that made the predators of the world decide, again and again, across hundreds of thousands of years, that we were not worth the risk. You inherited all of that, every bit of it. The safety you feel right now, drifting towards sleep, isn't the absence of danger. It's the presence of an enormously long chain of ancestors who solved the danger, one careful choice at a time, so that the version of you lying here tonight would never have to. There's one more thread worth pulling before we bring everything together tonight, because it might be the most directly felt inheritance of everything we've discussed, closer to your own experience of falling asleep than fire ash or hearth archaeology could ever be. Nearly every human culture ever studied has some form of bedtime ritual specifically for children, and a striking number of these rituals, across cultures with no historical contact whatsoever, share the same underlying structural elements: a lowered, softened voice, repetitive rhythm, and, this is the part worth sitting with, some explicit or implicit verbal reassurance that the child is safe, watched over, and does not need to remain alert. Lullabies across wildly different linguistic traditions frequently include lyrical content addressing exactly this theme: promises that someone is nearby, that morning will come, that nothing will happen while the child sleeps. It's such a consistent pattern that developmental psychologists studying infant and childhood sleep have proposed that bedtime reassurance rituals may serve a genuine, measurable function beyond simple comfort, actively helping a child's nervous system down-regulate the same evolved vigilance we've spent this entire video discussing, essentially communicating, generation after generation, parent to child, the message: the watch has been kept, you do not need to keep it yourself tonight. This matters because a child's instinctive resistance to falling asleep, the well-known and often exhausting reluctance so many parents recognize, the requests for one more story, one more song, the door left open, the light left on, may not simply be stalling or overstimulation. It may be, at least in part, the same ancient vigilance instinct we've traced across this entire video, activating in a young nervous system that hasn't yet accumulated enough repeated, reliable experience of safety to fully trust that the watch really is being kept. Every repeated bedtime ritual, every consistent lullaby, every reliably present adult voice in the dark, functions as one more small piece of evidence, gradually accumulated night after night, that it's safe to let go completely. Interestingly, this pattern doesn't disappear entirely in adulthood. It simply becomes quieter, more automatic, requiring far less conscious reassurance because it's already been so thoroughly reinforced across a lifetime of nights that turned out, overwhelmingly, to be safe. But the underlying mechanism never fully vanishes. It's part of why a familiar voice, even a recorded one, even one belonging to someone who has no actual ability to protect you from anything at all, can still carry a small measure of that same old reassurance. A distant, softened echo of a fire being tended, a watch being kept, a voice in the dark confirming, without needing to say so directly, that everything out there is being handled, and that you, right now, are free to stop paying attention completely. That, in its own way, is exactly what a video like this one is for. Before we bring everything together, it's worth being honest about the edges of this story. Because a mystery this old was never going to resolve into perfectly clean, fully certain answers. The lion speaker research, striking as it is, comes from a specific place and a specific moment in time: modern Kruger lions, whose relationship with humans has been shaped by more than a century of colonial-era hunting, ongoing anti-poaching enforcement, and decades of tourism-related human presence. Some researchers have raised a fair question: how much of the strong avoidance response documented in that research reflects something ancient and deeply learned across tens of thousands of years, versus something shaped more recently, within just the last century or two, of especially intense, especially lethal, human-lion conflict tied to colonial and post-colonial history in the region? The honest answer is that it's very difficult to fully separate these two timescales using behavioral research on modern animals alone. The ancient pattern and the recent pattern may simply be reinforcing each other, layered on top of one another, in ways that are hard to fully untangle. Similarly, the archaeological evidence for exactly when routine, nightly, protective fire use became truly universal across human populations is genuinely contested among researchers. Fire evidence at any given site depends heavily on preservation conditions, excavation methods, and simple archaeological luck. The absence of clear hearth evidence at a particular ancient site doesn't necessarily mean fire wasn't used there, only that clear evidence of it didn't happen to survive. This means our timeline, while built on real evidence, still carries real uncertainty, and future discoveries could meaningfully shift the picture. There's also an entire dimension of this story that's almost impossible to reconstruct directly: the actual, lived psychological experience of sleeping in a predator-dense landscape, night after night, across an entire lifetime. We can study behavior, we can study bones, we can study modern hunter-gatherer societies as an imperfect but useful window into practices that may resemble the deeper past, but the felt experience, the accumulated wisdom passed down in words and gestures and half-remembered warnings that left no trace in the archaeological record at all, is largely lost to us. We're reconstructing a system from its physical residue and doing a genuinely impressive job of it, but a residue is never quite the same as the whole. None of this weakens the overall picture we've built tonight. If anything, it makes it more honest, and in its own way, more interesting. A genuine, ongoing scientific mystery rather than a fully solved case file. Researchers are still gathering evidence, still refining timelines, still running new versions of the lion speaker experiment in new regions with new predator populations, still uncovering new hearth sites that push the fire use timeline earlier or complicate it further. The story you've heard tonight is our current best understanding, built carefully out of real evidence, but it's also, appropriately for a mystery about the deep, dark unknown of prehistoric nights, still not entirely finished being told. So let's bring the whole picture together, because it really is a remarkable one once you can see all the pieces at once. Human sleep, on its own, is a profound vulnerability. Deep, long, and largely defenseless, evolved without the light-sleeping, half-brain-awake adaptations that other exposed sleeping animals developed. On paper, that vulnerability should have been catastrophic for a species living for hundreds of thousands of years among some of the most capable predators the natural world has ever produced. It wasn't catastrophic, because the vulnerability was never faced alone. Fire transformed the darkness itself, stripping predators of their greatest natural advantage and triggering what appears to be a deep avoidance response in nearly every major predator species. Group sleeping, with its accidental but remarkably effective distribution of wakefulness across a night, meant that near-total vigilance was maintained across the group, even while each individual slept deeply and safely. Careful, deliberate site selection narrowed the angles of possible attack down to something a small, partially wakeful group could realistically defend. And underneath all of it, reinforced across countless generations, was something even less tangible, but perhaps most important of all, a reputation, learned and culturally transmitted within predator populations themselves, that marked humans not as an easy meal, but as a force too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too collectively retaliatory to be worth the risk. None of these four factors alone fully explains how sleep remained viable for our species. Together, layered on top of one another night after night for hundreds of thousands of years, they add up to something that looks, in hindsight, less like a series of lucky accidents and more like one of the quietest, least celebrated survival achievements in the entire story of our species. Not a war we won through strength, but a peace we built, night after night, out of firelight, watchfulness, and the accumulated, hard-earned caution of everything that once might have hunted us. For now, you don't have to remember any of this. You don't have to hold on to the details about lion avoidance research, or sentinel sleep patterns, or the deep architecture of a rock shelter chosen 40,000 years ago. You don't have to solve anything. You don't have to stay alert to anything at all, because that work, the actual work of building a world safe enough to fall completely, deeply, defenselessly asleep in, that work is already finished. It was finished by an unbroken line of ancestors who tended fires you'll never see, who took turns keeping watch through nights you'll never remember, who chose shelters and campsites with a kind of quiet, careful wisdom that got passed down, without any of them ever fully realizing it, all the way into the body you're lying in right now. You can let your eyes stay closed. You can let your breathing slow all the way down. Somewhere in the deep, old parts of your mind, the same instinct that once scanned the tree line for movement is still there, still working quietly in the background, but it isn't worried tonight. There's nothing circling. There's nothing testing the edge of the light. The watch has already been kept, 1,000 generations deep, and it has already been passed safely down to you. If tonight's journey helped carry your mind gently toward sleep, you can support this quiet little corner of curiosity in a few simple ways. A tap on the like button, not as any kind of big gesture, just as a soft signal that you'd like more nights like this one. A subscribe, if you'd like to keep drifting off to these long, gentle explorations of the strange and ancient corners of history. And if you'd like to go a little further in supporting the channel, there's an optional membership here on YouTube. Completely up to you. No pressure at all. Just a way to help keep these long, unhurried stories coming for anyone who needs them. I'd love to know, if you're still awake enough to type, where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. There's something quietly moving about knowing that somewhere it's early evening, and somewhere it's the middle of the night, and somewhere the sun is already starting to rise. All of us, in our own separate corners of the world, drifting toward the same rest, carried by the same old, patient rhythm that's been carrying humans safely through the dark for longer than anyone can really imagine. Let the fire in your mind burn low now. Let the watch end. Let everything settle. Rest well. May your sleep be as deep and as safe and as quietly guarded as it's ever been, because it is, and it always has been. Good night.